What that prisoner didn't know was that he'd just become part of one of the longest-running human experimentation programs in American history. A program that would operate for nearly 25 years. A program that would involve hundreds of experiments, thousands of men, and one doctor who saw an entire prison population as nothing more than laboratory material. Holmesburg Prison, located in northeast Philadelphia, was overcrowded, underfunded, and filled with men who had almost no power to refuse anything. Most were poor, many were black. All of them were trapped in a system that didn't care what happened to them. And to Dr. Kligman, they were perfect. He approached the prison administrators with a proposal. He wanted access to the prisoners, not to treat them, to test on them. In exchange, the prison would receive funding. The prisoners would receive small payments, cigarettes, a few dollars, maybe a radio if they participated in the longer studies. The prison agreed immediately. And so began an operation that would eventually involve more than 30 pharmaceutical companies, the United States Army, and, according to declassified documents, even the CIA. But in the beginning, it started with skin. Kligman's early experiments were relatively simple. He tested lotion, creams, and cosmetics. He wanted to see how different chemicals affected human skin under controlled conditions. The problem was, you couldn't do that kind of testing on the general public. It was unethical, it was dangerous. But inside a prison, according to Kligman, the rules were different. Sarcastic. He set up a laboratory inside the prison walls. He recruited assistants. He began enrolling prisoners into studies they barely understood. The consent forms, when they existed at all, were vague. Most men had no idea what was actually being applied to their bodies. They just knew they'd get paid. And that's exactly how Kligman wanted it. The experiments began simply enough. A patch test here, a cream there. But within a few years, the scope of what was happening inside Holmesburg Prison had expanded far beyond dermatology. By the mid-1950s, Kligman had established partnerships with some of the largest pharmaceutical companies in America. Johnson & Johnson, Dow Chemical, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. They all wanted the same thing, human test subjects who couldn't say no, and Kligman could provide them. According to former prisoners, the process was always the same. A doctor or assistant would approach you in the yard or in your cell. They'd offer you money, usually between $10 and $300 depending on the experiment. They'd tell you it was safe, they'd tell you it was simple, and if you agreed, they'd take you to a room where other men were already waiting. What happened next depended on what they were testing that week. Some men had patches of skin, removed entirely. Others had chemicals applied to their backs, their arms, their faces. Some were injected with experimental drugs. Others were exposed to controlled doses of radiation. The tests could last hours, days, in some cases months, and the men were never told what was being done to them. Surprised, one former prisoner later described having a substance applied to his skin that burned so intensely he couldn't sleep for 3 days. When he complained, he was told it was a normal reaction. When the skin began to blister and crack, he was told to wait it out. When it became infected, he was finally given ointment. But no apology, no explanation, just ointment. Another man recalled being placed in a room with several other prisoners and being told to sit still while a mist was sprayed into the air. They breathed it in for over an hour. Afterward, several of them became violently ill, vomiting, dizziness, disorientation. They were monitored for a few days, then released back into the general population. No follow-up, no medical care. They never found out what they'd been exposed to. But perhaps the most disturbing experiments were the ones that didn't involve the skin at all. In the 1960s, Dr. Kligman began collaborating with the United States Army. Declassified documents reveal that the Army was interested in testing the effects of chemical agents on human subjects. Agents that could be used in warfare. Agents that could incapacitate, disorient, or kill. And Holmesburg Prison became one of their testing sites. Exhales sharply. According to military records, prisoners were exposed to compounds including dioxin, the same toxic chemical later found in Agent Orange. They were given experimental psychoactive drugs. They were subjected to extreme temperatures to see how the body responded under stress. Some men were placed in isolation chambers for extended periods. Others were deprived of sleep for days at a time. The army paid well. Kligman accepted the contracts. And the prisoners had no idea they were being used as guinea pigs for chemical warfare research. One man, who participated in what he thought was a simple skin cream test, later discovered that he'd been exposed to a Class A carcinogen. He developed lesions that never fully healed. Years later, he would be diagnosed with cancer. He tried to sue, but by then, the records had been destroyed. And that's the pattern that emerges again and again when you look into the Holmesburg experiments. Evidence disappears. Consent forms go missing. Medical records are incomplete or never existed in the first place. And the men who suffered are left with scars they can't explain and illnesses no one will take responsibility for. But Kligman's operation didn't just continue. It expanded. By the late 1960s, the Holmesburg experiments had become a full-scale medical industry. Dr. Kligman was earning hundreds of thousands of dollars. The University of Pennsylvania was receiving grant money and prestige. Pharmaceutical companies were fast-tracking products to market, and the prisoners were still being paid in cigarettes. But something else was happening too. Word was starting to spread. Inmates began comparing symptoms. Men who had participated in different studies realized they were all experiencing the same things: chronic pain, permanent scarring, skin discoloration that wouldn't fade, respiratory problems that appeared out of nowhere, and in some cases, psychological effects that no one could explain. One former prisoner reported that after participating in a drug trial, he began experiencing vivid hallucinations that lasted for months. Another said he developed tremors in his hands that never went away. A third man claimed that after being part of an experiment involving injections, he lost feeling in parts of his body entirely. When they asked what had been done to them, they were told the studies were confidential. And still, the experiments continued. According to investigative reports, at the peak of the program, nearly 90% of Holmesburg's inmate population had participated in at least one experiment. Some men did it once and refused to go back, went away. A third man claimed that after being part of an experiment involving injections, he lost feeling in parts of his body entirely. When they asked what had been done to them, they were told the studies were confidential. Exhales sharply. And still the experiments continued. According to investigative reports, at the peak of the program, nearly 90% of Holmesburg's inmate population had participated in at least one experiment. Some men did it once and refused to go back. Others became repeat participants, driven by financial desperation or addiction to the small privileges the money could buy. Kligman cultivated this dependency. He made sure the payments were just enough to matter but not enough to change anyone's circumstances. He rotated experiments so there was always something new being tested. He created a system where participation felt voluntary, but refusal meant losing access to one of the few sources of income available inside the prison. It was coercion disguised as choice. And then there were the men who didn't volunteer at all. Multiple former inmates have alleged that some prisoners were experimented on without their knowledge, that substances were added to food, that injections were given under the guise of routine medical care, that men were told they were receiving treatment for existing conditions when they were actually being enrolled in trials. These allegations have never been fully investigated. The records that might prove or disprove them are long gone, but the pattern is consistent enough to be disturbing. In 1966, the story briefly reached the public. A reporter published an article exposing some of what was happening at Holmesburg. There was minor outrage. A few questions were asked, but Kligman defended his work. He argued that the prisoners were compensated, that they volunteered, that the research was valuable, and that without it, medical progress would be impossible. Fully investigated. The records that might prove or disprove them are long gone, but the pattern is consistent enough to be disturbing. In 1966, the story briefly reached the public. A reporter published an article exposing some of what was happening at Holmesburg. There was minor outrage. A few questions were asked, but Kligman defended his work. He argued that the prisoners were compensated, that they volunteered, that the research was valuable, and that without it, medical progress would be impossible. The University of Pennsylvania stood by him. The pharmaceutical companies continued their contracts, and the experiments went on for another 8 years. It wasn't until 1974 that the program finally shut down, not because of ethical concerns, not because of public pressure, but because new regulations were passed that made it harder to conduct human experimentation without rigorous oversight. The kind of oversight that would expose what had really been happening inside Holmesburg Prison. So Kligman quietly closed his laboratory. The pharmaceutical companies moved their testing elsewhere. The army found new facilities, and the prisoners were left with nothing but scars and unanswered questions. Dr. Albert Kligman went on to have a celebrated career. He became famous for co-developing Retin A, a widely used acne medication. He received awards, he published papers, he trained a generation of dermatologists, and for decades, almost no one talked about Holmesburg. But the men who were experimented on didn't forget. In the years after Holmesburg closed its experimental program, former prisoners began to speak out, but their voices were largely ignored. They had criminal records, they had no medical documentation, and the institutions that had used them had no interest in acknowledging what had happened. Some men tried to sue. In 2000, a group of former Holmesburg inmates filed a lawsuit against Dr. Kligman, the University of Pennsylvania, and several pharmaceutical companies. They alleged that they had been subjected to dangerous experiments without informed consent, that they had suffered permanent physical and psychological damage, and that they had been exploited because of their incarceration. The case moved slowly through the courts. Lawyers argued over jurisdiction, statute of limitations, and whether the prisoners could prove they hadn't truly consented. In 2007, the lawsuit was dismissed. The judge ruled that too much time had passed, that the plaintiffs couldn't definitively prove which experiments had caused which injuries, and that the doctrine of informed consent as it existed in the 1950s and 60s was different from modern standards. The men received nothing. Says Dr. Kligman, in interviews before his death in 2010, expressed no remorse. Sarcastic, he maintained that his work had been important, that the prisoners had volunteered, that any harm done was minimal compared to the medical breakthroughs achieved. When pressed about the ethics of testing on incarcerated populations, he reportedly said, "Everyone was doing it at the time." And he wasn't entirely wrong. Holmesburg wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of human experimentation that occurred throughout the 20th century. The Tuskegee syphilis study, the Guatemala experiments, the radiation tests on patients without consent. Again and again, vulnerable populations were used as test subjects because they had no power to refuse. But what makes Holmesburg particularly disturbing is the scale and the duration. This wasn't a single unethical study. It was an entire system, one that operated openly, with institutional support, for nearly a quarter century. And when it ended, the people responsible faced no consequences. The University of Pennsylvania has acknowledged that the experiments occurred. In 1998, they issued a statement expressing regret, but they stopped short of a formal apology. They argued that the research had been conducted according to the standards of the time, that Kligman had believed he was operating ethically, and that the university couldn't be held responsible for practices that were later deemed unacceptable. Exhale sharply. The pharmaceutical companies that funded the research have said even less. Most have never publicly commented on their involvement. The contracts are buried. The data has been absorbed into proprietary research. And the products developed using information gathered at Holmesburg are still on the market today. You may have used some of them yourself. That face cream in your bathroom, that acne treatment, that anti-aging serum. Somewhere in the long chain of development and testing that brought those products to market, there may be data that came from a man who had no choice, who was paid $5 to have chemicals burned into his skin, who was never told what he was participating in, who carries the scars to this day. And you'll never know which products those are, because the records don't exist anymore. In 2007, a book was published documenting the Holmesburg experiments in detail. It included interviews with former prisoners, declassified documents, testimonies from people who had worked in the program. The evidence was overwhelming. The story was undeniable. But it didn't lead to justice. It didn't result in accountability. It simply became another disturbing chapter in medical history, something to be studied, discussed, and then quietly filed away. Today, Holmesburg Prison still stands. It's been closed since 1995. The buildings are decaying, the cells are empty, but if you walk through the corridors where the experiments took place, you can still see the rooms, the tables, the places where men were strapped down and tested on. Exhales. Some of the former prisoners are still alive. They're older now. Many are sick. They live with chronic pain, with illnesses they can't afford to treat, with psychological trauma that was never addressed. A few have tried to tell their stories. Most have given up. Because the uncomfortable truth is that no one really wants to hear it. We want to believe that human experimentation is something that happened in the past, in Nazi Germany, in distant places, by evil people who were clearly monsters. We don't want to believe it happened at a respected American university, that it was funded by companies we still trust, that it was carried out by a doctor who won awards and died honored. But it did happen, for 23 years, to thousands of men, in a prison just outside Philadelphia, and the people responsible were never punished. Dr. Albert Kligman died in 2010 at the age of 93. His obituary in the New York Times called him a groundbreaking dermatologist. It mentioned his contributions to skin science, high-S development of retin A, his decades of research and teaching. Holmesburg was mentioned in a single sentence near the end. The men who were experimented on received no obituaries, no recognition, no acknowledgement of what was taken from them. They were just prisoners, just test subjects, just acres of skin. Pause. And somewhere, in a laboratory you'll never see, on a shelf you'll never access, there are files. Data collected from experiments you'll never read about. Results that were used to develop products you use every day. The science moved forward. The market grew. The profits were made. And the men who made it possible were forgotten. That's the legacy of Holmesburg, not just what happened, but what we chose to do about it afterward, which was nothing.